On my first day, I arrived early. The school loomed before me, old, tall, and neglected. Its walls were stained from years of repainting over what couldn't be scrubbed away, giving it a ghostly appearance. The classroom they assigned to me was at the end of a dim corridor, just beyond the main stairwell. A plaque by the door read Room 302. As I stepped inside, I was greeted by the familiar smell of every old classroom, thick with dust and chalk that had been ground into the floorboards over decades. Wooden desks filled the room, some marked with the initials of former students, reminders of lives once lived within these walls. An unsettling silence hung in the air, but I shook it off. I was just nervous, I told myself. First days were always strange, especially in new schools. This one had its own peculiar reputation, but work was work, and I had been in need of a job for months now. Then came the envelope. It lay neatly on my desk when I arrived, its presence both inviting and ominous. There was no name on it, just the words, "Read carefully," scrawled across the front in looping black ink. It was addressed to Mr. Lee, which meant someone knew I was coming. My heart raced as I picked it up, tore the top off, and slid out a single sheet of paper. The rules for Room 302 were chillingly simple. 1. Do not let any child sit too close to one another. They must sit at least one desk apart at all times. 2. When a child stares at you for longer than a few seconds, look away and pretend not to notice. 3. If you hear scratching from under the floor, ignore it completely. 4. Do not look at the clock between 2:11 and 2:13 p.m. 5. If a child brings you a gift, do not accept it. Politely decline and tell them to take it back. 6. Do not acknowledge any child who knocks on the door after the bell rings. 7. If you find a child standing in the corner facing the wall, do not disturb them. They will leave on their own. 8. When the bell rings at 3:15, leave immediately. Do not stay behind to grade or organize. I read the list again, feeling a chill creep up my spine. But I brushed it off as some initiation prank for new teachers. Every school had its way of testing the new guy. Folding the paper, I slid it into my bag, thinking I might keep it for later, just for laughs. Then, as if on cue, the door creaked open. An older woman stepped in, her glasses perched low on her nose, silver gray hair pulled back in a tight bun. She didn't introduce herself. Instead, she simply nodded in my direction and gestured to the desk. Her eyes were sharp, and I could tell she'd been here a long time. "Are you Mr. Lee?" she asked, her voice steady. I nodded. "Yeah, I got here early. Just wanted to set up, you know." Good. Keep to the rules," she said, her tone grave. "They aren't a joke." With that, she left, the door clicking shut behind her. I wanted to laugh, maybe shout after her, "All right, nice try." But something stopped me. The way she looked at me, as if she knew something I didn't, lingered long after she'd left. I shook it off and returned to setting up my room. By the time the bell rang, I was seated at my desk, pretending to be relaxed. Students began to file in, looking as ordinary as any other kids. Maybe a little pale, yes, and some were quieter than I was used to. But I told myself that was normal. New teacher, new year, nothing out of the ordinary. Yet, I quickly noticed a strange habit among the children. None of them sat next to one another. They chose their seats automatically, one desk apart, scattered like fallen leaves. I hadn't even needed to remind them. Halfway through attendance, I felt a pair of eyes on me. I looked up, meeting the gaze of a girl sitting by the window. Her face was blank and unreadable, her stare relentless. Her eyes were oddly wide, too focused. I remembered rule number 2. My heart raced as I dropped my eyes to the attendance sheet, my fingers clenching the pencil tightly. She was still staring. I could feel it, but I forced myself to keep looking away, skimming the list over and over until I felt her finally look away. When I dared to look up again, her attention had returned to the window. An hour passed, and the lesson moved along slowly. I was going over multiplication tables, trying to gauge the attention spans of my students. To my surprise, they seemed remarkably good, though I suspected it was only because they didn't fidget. They sat eerily still, their eyes fixed on me with a seriousness I hadn't expected. Then, during silent reading time, I heard it, a scratching, faint but distant, coming from below the floorboards. I stiffened. A wave of dread washed over me, and I wanted to look down, but rule number 3 surfaced in my mind. Ignore it completely. I forced myself to keep reading aloud, willing my voice to stay steady, even as the scratching grew louder, like something just beneath us was clawing, trying to break through. It was hard not to react, but I focused on the book, desperately willing the noise to fade. Finally, the scratching stopped. A few of the kids exchanged glances, but none of them said a word about it. They returned to their books, and I realized that this was normal to them. They'd heard that noise before. I told myself I'd get through this day. I just had to follow the rules. During the next activity, I noticed 2 students, a girl and a boy, eyeing each other with what seemed like thinly veiled contempt. The boy had unnaturally sharp features, his eyes a strange cold gray. The girl, seated a desk away, had teeth that seemed a little too pointed, even from where I sat. Rule number 1 echoed in my mind: don't let any child sit too close to another. I realized what that meant. I kept a close eye on them, noticing how tense they were. Their eyes flicked toward each other now and then, and though they didn't make a move, there was something unsettling in the way they looked at one another, as if they were watching for weakness, ready to pounce. I cleared my throat, attempting to sound casual. All right, everyone, time to switch activities. Let's get out our spelling workbooks. The students moved slowly, each one pulling their workbook from their bag with almost mechanical precision. The boy's cold gaze never left the girl, whose lips curled into a slight smirk, as if she were daring him to do something. I wondered how close they had been seated last year before someone thought up this rule. To break the tension, I decided to walk around the room. As I passed their desks, I noticed something unsettling. The girl had claw marks on the back of her chair, deep scratches gouged into the wood. The boy's chair was equally marked. I glanced down and saw that both of them had faint scars on their arms, hidden mostly by the long sleeves of their uniforms. They each noticed me looking, and their eyes sharpened, filled with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Without warning, I pretended to be interested in the next student's workbook instead, feeling their eyes follow me as I walked away. Lunch came and went without much incident. I took my break alone, eating my sandwich at my desk, trying to act normal despite the strange events of the morning. But the air felt heavy, charged with an unspoken tension, as if the very walls of the classroom were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. I kept my eyes glued to the clock, noting each passing second. I didn't want to accidentally glance at it at the wrong moment, but there was an odd itch of curiosity gnawing at me. What would happen if I looked between 2:11 and 2:13 p.m.? As if on cue, the intercom crackled to life. It was the same older woman who had greeted me that morning. Her voice was clear and flat, devoid of warmth. She didn't greet me or ask how my day was going. She simply said, "Remember the rules." Then the line went dead. The rest of the day crawled forward, each minute stretching out like an eternity, bringing me closer to that dreaded hour. I had managed to cover the first 3 rules without too much trouble, though I had to admit I had never felt so tense in my life. I tried not to watch the clock, but the children, for their part, seemed unbothered, as if they had done this dance countless times before. Then, at exactly 2:10, I looked away from the clock, determined not to slip. I glanced around the room, trying to focus on anything else, but something felt wrong. The atmosphere had shifted. The room seemed quieter. I couldn't explain it, but the usual shuffling and the sound of pages turning had faded into an unsettling silence. When I looked up, I saw the children sitting motionless, their eyes fixed on their desks as if waiting for something. I counted the seconds in my head, my pulse racing, wondering what would happen if I dared to look at the clock. But the thought of breaking the rule kept me rooted to my chair, my eyes pinned to the wall above the students' heads. The silence thickened with every tick of the second hand, which I could hear but not see. It was the longest 2 minutes of my life. Then, at exactly 2:13, the silence lifted and the children moved again, as if nothing had happened. I let out a slow breath, shaken but relieved. I had followed the rules. Nothing had happened. I had gotten through the worst of it, or so I thought. As the clock edged toward the final bell, one of the girls, the one who had stared at me earlier, suddenly got up from her desk. She didn't look at me or anyone else as she walked to the front of the room, clutching something in her hand. My heart raced as she stopped in front of my desk, staring down at the object she held. It was a crudely made doll, sewn from scraps of fabric and buttons, its mismatched eyes staring blankly back at me. The doll seemed to pulsate with a life of its own, an unsettling energy radiating from it. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end as she extended it toward me, her expression unreadable. "Do you want to play?" she whispered, her voice barely above a breath, sending a chill down my spine. What had I gotten myself into? The rules echoed in my mind, but the weight of the moment pressed down on me, suffocating and inevitable. Its face was drawn on with ink, dark eyes staring up at me from the fabric. "I made this for you," she said, holding it out. Her voice was barely a whisper. I remembered rule number 5. "Thank you," I replied, my voice steady. "But I can't accept it. Why don't you keep it?" She blinked, her expression unreadable, and looked down at the doll in her hands. For a moment, she looked almost hurt, but then, with a strange vacant nod, she turned and walked back to her desk, tucking the doll into her bag. I glanced at the clock, noting that we only had a few minutes left. I just needed to get through until the bell. But as I looked back at the class, my heart sank. I saw a boy standing in the corner, facing the wall. He hadn't been there a moment ago. My stomach twisted as Rule 6 echoed in my mind. Do not disturb them. They will leave on their own. He was completely still, hands at his sides, head tilted downward. The other students ignored him, their eyes fixed forward, as if he didn't exist. I forced myself to turn back to my desk, fighting the urge to glance over my shoulder. Seconds ticked by, each one stretching longer than the last, until I heard the bell ring. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my bag, barely sparing a glance at the class as I walked out the door. The older woman was standing by the exit, watching me. She didn't smile or say anything, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes. Approval, maybe, or pity. I couldn't tell. "You did well," she murmured as I passed, almost too softly to hear. Outside, the afternoon air was sharp and cold, biting at my skin as I walked to my car. I didn't look back at the building. I didn't want to risk even a glimpse of room 302 through one of its grimy windows. I told myself I'd get used to it. Maybe it was just a rough first day, and things would get easier. But as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had left something behind, or that something had followed me. That night, I tried to push everything from my mind. I chalked it up to my nerves, strange kids, a strict set of rules meant to scare the new guy. I'd been sleep deprived, and who knew? Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I could still feel those strange, hollow eyes on me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them. The boy standing in the corner, the girl with her doll, the silent classroom waiting, as if for something hidden in the silence. I slept poorly, plagued by a dream where I stood alone in room 302, counting desks in the darkness, feeling like I was waiting for something that never came. I'd look down at the clock, its hands locked at 2:12, ticking but never moving. I'd wake up to the pitch-black room, my heart hammering, staring into the darkness, half expecting to see one of those kids standing in the corner. The next morning, I arrived at school early again, determined to keep the routine steady. If the kids were playing some game, or if the school had its own bizarre culture, I'd just handle it. I'd managed unruly classes before, and I wasn't about to let a bunch of middle schoolers spook me out of a job. But room 302 felt different. As I walked in, the air was stale, almost thicker, as if something had changed overnight. I checked around the desks, almost on instinct, and froze. The desk where the boy with the gray eyes had sat the day before was empty, devoid of all the usual scattered papers and books the other students left behind. There was something else, a faint dark stain near the corner of the desk, as if someone had spilled ink or something far worse. The bell rang, jolting me out of my thoughts, and students began to trickle in. They filed in one by one, taking their seats with that same robotic precision. The girl who had offered me the doll entered last. She hesitated at the door, glancing towards the empty desk. For the first time, I saw a flicker of emotion on her face, something akin to fear, or perhaps loss. And then, as if catching herself, she took her seat by the window, turning her face away from me. After I took attendance, I couldn't help myself. "Hey, where's—" I stopped, realizing I couldn't remember the boy's name. I'd taken it down yesterday, but it had slipped from my mind. I cleared my throat, trying again. "Anybody know where the boy who sat there is today?" The silence that followed was suffocating. Every eye turned toward me, blank and unreadable. Not a single one spoke. Even the girl by the window refused to look at me. Her shoulders were tense, her eyes fixed downward. I tried to shrug it off, but there was an undeniable tension in the room. I turned to the lesson plan, guiding them through their work, desperately trying to ignore the unease churning in my stomach. The kids moved through their exercises, their faces expressionless, their eyes too wide and glassy. The day stretched on, slower than before, each hour bleeding into the next. By lunch, I felt like I'd been there for days. I couldn't stop glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see that gray-eyed boy sitting in his seat or standing in the corner watching me. The other teachers ate in a separate lounge, but I wasn't sure I wanted to talk to them about this. They probably thought I was the weird one. Just after lunch, I found another note on my desk. It wasn't in an envelope this time, just a single slip of paper, torn at the edges, as if it had been ripped quickly from a notebook. It read, "There are consequences if you don't follow the rules." I stared at the note, my heart racing. Someone was trying to mess with me. Maybe the other teachers, maybe one of the students. But the handwriting was strange, thin and uneven, as though written by someone who hadn't held a pen in a long time. I crumpled it up, shoving it into my bag, and forced myself to continue. When I looked up, every single one of them was watching me, the whole class. Their heads were all turned in my direction, their eyes blank, their expressions too still. I cleared my throat, turning back to the chalkboard, but I could feel them watching, their eyes boring into my back. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I moved through the motions, keeping my head down, careful to avoid the clock between 2:11 and 2:13. The scratching from beneath the floor started up again, louder this time, as if something was getting closer, clawing at the boards right below me. I kept my face expressionless, ignoring it, waiting for it to end. It wasn't until dismissal that things really went sideways. I was packing up my things when the girl who'd offered me the doll approached again. She was clutching a small object wrapped in cloth, holding it out with both hands. "Take it," she whispered. I took a slow breath, remembering rule number 5. "I'm sorry," I said. "I really can't. Why don't you keep it, okay?" Her expression darkened, and for a moment, her lips curled into something close to a snarl. But then, as quickly as it appeared, the expression vanished, and she looked down at the wrapped object, clutching it to her chest. "I tried to warn you," she murmured. She turned and walked to the door, joining the other students as they filed out. Inside, silence enveloped the room. The bell rang, and I packed up quickly, remembering rule number 8. I grabbed my things, checking the room one last time to make sure I hadn't left anything behind, then headed for the door. As I reached the threshold, I felt a strange urge to look back, just one last look. Something about that empty classroom felt wrong. I resisted, stepping out into the hall, but the feeling followed me. On my way down the hall, I saw the janitor, an older man with a weathered face, mopping the floor with slow, careful precision. He looked up as I passed, his eyes lingering on me with something close to sympathy. "They didn't tell you much, did they?" I paused, unsure of how to respond. "About the rules." He nodded, his eyes dark and knowing. "They don't tell anyone everything. They think it's easier that way. But easier ain't always safer," he replied, his voice heavy with resignation. I furrowed my brow, puzzled by his cryptic words. "What does that mean?" I asked, seeking clarity. He sighed deeply, glancing down at his mop, the bristles dragging across the floor like a weary soldier on a battlefield. "There's no way to keep it safe, not completely, not with those things," he murmured, his eyes lifting to meet mine. A shiver ran down my spine as he continued, Just remember, Mr. Lee, those kids are only part of it. There's more here, things even they don't understand. Before I could ask anything else, he turned back to his mopping, his shoulders hunched as though the weight of his own words pressed down on him like a leaden shroud. I drove home with those ominous phrases swirling in my mind, the image of those empty eyes haunting me. I wondered if the janitor had once been like me, someone new, someone who had simply tried to follow the rules. The next morning, I almost didn't go back. My alarm blared at 6:30, its shrill sound cutting through the silence of dawn. For a long time I lay there, staring at the ceiling, contemplating quitting, finding another job, telling myself I wasn't right for this place. But I needed the work, and leaving felt like admitting defeat. So, with a heavy heart, I went back. Room 302 was silent when I arrived, but something was different. In the back, there was a new desk, one I hadn't seen before. A small, empty seat waited for someone who hadn't arrived yet. A chill gripped me as I recalled the gray boy. It was as if he had vanished into thin air, leaving no trace behind. As the students began to arrive, filling the seats one by one, their faces were blank, their eyes hollow, as if life had been drained from them. The girl who had offered me the doll the day before avoided my gaze, her expression dark and foreboding. When she took her seat, I noticed something clutched in her hand. A small, wrapped bundle, identical to the one she had offered me previously. The morning passed in eerie silence. The children moved through their exercises with a robotic precision, as if they were puppets acting out a familiar scene, each one rehearsing their part in a play that I could not comprehend. I kept my distance, watching them with growing unease, desperately trying to keep track of all the rules. Then, just before lunch, I heard it, a knock at the door. I froze, my heart racing, recalling rule number 6. I wasn't supposed to acknowledge any child who knocked after the bell. But this was different. The knock was slow and deliberate, echoing through the room with an eerie rhythm that sent chills down my spine. The kids didn't react. They kept their heads down, their eyes fixed on their desks, as though they couldn't hear it. I stared at the door, my hand hovering over the doorknob, caught in a battle between curiosity and caution. The rule was clear. Don't acknowledge it. The knock continued, louder now, a steady, insistent sound that seemed to reverberate through the walls of the classroom. I gritted my teeth, forcing myself to ignore it, to focus on the lesson, to pretend I couldn't hear the door shaking on its hinges. But then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the knocking stopped. I exhaled, my shoulders slumping with relief. Whatever that had been, it was over now. But when I turned back to the room, a sense of dread washed over me. The air felt thicker, charged with an unspoken tension, as if the very walls were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. I realized I'd made a grave mistake. The students were no longer sitting at their desks. They were standing, each one motionless, facing me with those same empty eyes. My stomach dropped, and I took a step back, almost tripping over my own feet. The silence was suffocating, filling the air with an unnatural stillness that pressed down on me like a weight. The girl by the window, the one with the doll, stood slightly ahead of the others, her hands clasped in front of her, holding that small wrapped bundle. "Mr. Lee," she whispered, her voice a haunting echo in the silence. I didn't respond. I couldn't. "You didn't follow the rules," she continued, a hint of sorrow lacing her words, as though I had disappointed her. I did, I blurted out, desperation creeping into my voice. I didn't break any rules. She tilted her head, her eyes narrowing slightly as if she were dissecting my every word. You looked back yesterday after the bell rang. You weren't supposed to. My heart sank. I had looked back, just for a fleeting second to see the empty classroom, but I hadn't even considered it would count as breaking a rule. Rules are rules, she said softly, and the other children echoed her words, their voices forming a chilling chorus. Rules are rules. The phrase hung in the air like a judgment passed down from some unseen authority. Look, come on, I didn't mean to, I started, but the girl raised a finger, silencing me with an authority that sent shivers down my spine. Sometimes, one mistake is all it takes, she said, stepping forward and holding out the wrapped bundle. I tried to help you. I wanted you to be safe. I took a shaky step back, unwilling to accept whatever she was offering. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my feet felt rooted to the spot, as if the very ground had claimed me. The girl's eyes darkened, and for the first time, I saw something else behind them, something ancient, something far older than the child she appeared to be. The other students began to move, slow and methodical, forming a half circle around me. They held their hands at their sides, their expressions unreadable, their eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I tried to step backward, but I felt the wall pressing against my back. Look, it's okay. I won't break any more rules, I stammered, desperation creeping into my voice. The girl's expression softened, almost pitying. It's not that simple. And then, without warning, she unwrapped the bundle in her hands. Inside lay a small wooden figure, crudely carved and twisted. Its features barely resembled a human form, but it wasn't the doll itself that terrified me. It was the fact that it looked exactly like me. The figure's face was painted with a dark smudge where the mouth should be, its eyes hollow and empty. A wave of nausea washed over me as I stared at it, and the room seemed to close in around me, the walls pressing closer as if they were alive. The children moved in closer, their eyes fixed on the doll as though waiting for it to spring to life. Slowly, the girl held up the doll, facing me, and twisted its head. A searing pain shot through my skull, blinding and sharp, like ice pressing into my temples. I gasped, clutching my head, as the world around me twisted and warped. The children's whispers grew louder, echoing in my mind, drowning out my thoughts. Rules are rules, they chanted, a relentless mantra that filled the air with dread. I was trapped, ensnared in a web of their making, and I could feel the darkness closing in, ready to consume me whole. I clutched my head, doubling over, barely able to keep myself upright. The room spun around me, my vision blurring as if reality itself was unraveling. It felt like my very thoughts were being pulled apart, like strings fraying in my mind. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped my lips. My throat felt closed, my voice stolen. I was trapped in my own silence, the agony radiating through every nerve. The children's voices began to echo in my ears, distorted and overlapping. Their words merged into a single, relentless chant. One mistake is all it takes. I could feel the weight of their stares pressing in on me, suffocating. I wanted to run, but my body wouldn't respond. I was frozen, paralyzed by fear. The pain in my head intensified, and I felt something pulling at me, a dark force that threatened to consume me. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the pain stopped. I collapsed to my knees, my vision swimming as I struggled to regain control. When I looked up, the children were still watching me, their expressions blank, but their eyes seemed different, sharper, more focused, as if they were studying me, waiting to see what I would do next. The girl with the doll knelt down in front of me, her face inches from mine. "You have to stay here now," she said softly. I tried to shake my head, to protest, but the words wouldn't come. My throat felt tight, my body numb. I could feel the pull of the doll, the way it seemed to reach inside me, anchoring itself to my very soul. The bell rang, signaling the end of the day, but none of the students moved. They stood there, watching me as if waiting for something. Then, slowly, they began to file out of the room, one by one, their faces expressionless, their steps eerily synchronized. The girl was the last to leave, pausing at the door to look back at me one final time. "See you tomorrow, Mr. Lee. We'll try to be nice." When the last of them left, I staggered to my feet, clutching the desk for support. My heart pounded in my chest, racing with a mix of fear and confusion. I glanced around the room, taking a shaky breath, trying to steady myself. But I could still feel the doll's presence, heavy and oppressive. Deep down, I knew that something had changed, that I had left something behind, or that something had latched onto me, pulling me into a world I couldn't escape. For a long time, I just stood there, staring at the empty classroom. The desks were arranged in their neat rows, the faint scratches on the floorboards barely visible in the dim light. It looked ordinary, but I knew better. Months have passed since then, maybe years. I don't know anymore. Every day feels the same. I come in, follow the rules, teach the lessons, and ignore the strangeness of it all. I see the doll on my desk, watching me with those empty eyes, its head twisted at an odd angle. I always feel the pull of it. The rules have become second nature. I avoid the clock between 2:11 and 2:13. I ignore the scratching from below, whatever the hell that is. I dismiss the knocking at the door and the children's strange looks. I've gotten to know the kids more, actually. Some are quite scary, but most of them aren't that bad. They do like to learn. They always pay attention. They even remembered my birthday and got me a special cake. It was surprisingly good, tasting of strawberries and memories. I do wish I could leave, though, or at the very least, have the summers off. Every morning, I wake up knowing I have to go back to that room. I've become a part of the rules, a fixture there. And no matter how much I want to escape, I know that I can never truly leave.